Well, good afternoon and welcome to this first of my Meet the Candidate events. I'm going to be holding quite a number of these, so don't worry if you don't get the chance to have your question answered. There's going to be lots of opportunities. Today we're joined by the current MSP for Falkirk East, Angus MacDonald, and I'm going to ask him some questions before he turns it around and asks me some questions. So when we get to the bit where you ask yours, could you please just put question at the front of it, because there's going to be a lot of general commentary and all the different Facebook pages and so on. So I suppose, Angus, the first thing I would like to note and really say publicly is to thank you for your public service over many, many years, both as an MSP and prior to that as a councillor. And I think I would point out that unless you've done a similar role, most people don't appreciate the effort and commitment required to perform public service in this way. And incidentally, I include all political parties in that. It's a very, very tough job. So how does it feel to be bringing this part of your kind of career to a close?
Well, thanks for your kind words, Michelle. They're really appreciated. It'll be 29 years this year since I first got elected to the former Falkirk District Council, beating Labour into second place, which felt good. So clearly it's going to be quite a wrench to leave elected politics in Falkirk District. For most of my life, I've been torn between two parts of Scotland, Falkirk District and the Western Isles, and it's probably fair to say that I've sacrificed a completely different life in the Hebrides for a life serving the people of Grangemouth initially, and latterly the whole of Falkirk East. But that's been my choice, and it's been an honour and a privilege to represent my electorate at the Falkirk District Council, then Falkirk Council, and then the Scottish Parliament. So it's kind of bittersweet, to be honest. The islands of the Hebrides have a habit of calling their sons and daughters back home, and I've succumbed to that call. So in short, I'm sad to be leaving, but I'm happy to be returning to the land of my roots. My genes go back at least 1,000 years in the Hebrides, so I guess it was only a matter of time before I would head home. But safe in the knowledge that I've given the best I possibly could to the people of Falkirk East.
Well, thank you very much. I know it's appreciated by absolutely everyone who's come into contact with you. So as you look over the last 10 years as an MSP in particular, tell me, for example, 3 areas that you're most proud of and why that is the case.
Well, there's been so much legislation gone through Parliament over the past 10 years, but I guess the top 3 that I'm most proud of are the effective banning of fracking, the land reform and community empowerment legislation that we put through in 2015-16, and of course, what has been sort of my baby, the deposit return scheme, which will be introduced in Scotland next year. Now, I've been banging on about getting that introduced since I first got elected in 1992, but I find we always get there in the end. So nearly 3 decades later, we're nearly there. My old school motto at Keele was persevere and hope, which has come in handy a few times. And I can tell you the deposit return is a prime example of that. On fracking, while everyone in the SNP can claim credit for the ban on fracking and be proud of that, I have to say I work behind the scenes to help get that result. There's ways and means of operating behind the scenes to good effect, and with regard to fracking, I used every avenue that I possibly could. In Parliament, we can often bump into senior figures in the corridors of power, and hope I'm not giving away any secrets, even in the underground car parks. So on these occasions, I take every opportunity to speak privately to the powers that be. And I recall one conversation, I won't say who with, where I stressed there would be a mass exodus of our newly acquired membership. At the time, our party had grown from around 20,000 to 125,000 just after IndieRef. However, many of those new members, as you know, Michelle, were threatening to leave if fracking was approved. So it wasn't just the environmental issues that we had to consider. It was the strength of the party too, and we had to play the long game to avoid any legal challenge. I know that was frustrating to many of our members and members of the public, but we had to avoid fracking being approved by default by judges rather than politicians. So our full tactics couldn't be divulged at the time, but I'm glad enough people had faith, knowing that we would get there in the end. I find that we always do. So I think it has to be said that it was a long game, but it was worth the tactics that we used.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, yeah, the results could be seen, and you're correct about it having to have a variety of strategies to where you want to get to be. And it's not always immediately evident to people that that is the case. And sometimes you can't speak about stuff that's going on behind the scenes. And, you know, a lot of people often forget that. So that's an important point you've made.
Absolutely. You can't always divulge plan A, never mind plan B. So
yeah.
If I could say a few words on land reform, Michelle.
Yeah.
Well, obviously that was an issue that I had an interest in all my adult life, and coming from a family which was affected by the Highland clearances, I've always believed that many of the wrongs should be put right, and one of those is the concentration of ownership of large tracts of land in the Highlands and Islands by wealthy individuals. So our land reform bill in 2016, which was quite radical, but not as radical as we would have liked because we were constrained by ECHR rules at the time, but we made significant inroads into dealing with the issue. And we set up the Scottish Land Commission to look at moving land reform forward, which I'm glad to say has done a lot since then, bringing radical proposals up for discussion to the extent that there'll more than likely be another significant land reform bill in the next term of Parliament. So it'll be over to you to deal with that. But my only regret is I won't be there to be part of that, but I'll be watching closely from afar, and I might even get involved with the Community Land Scotland group once I'm back in the Hebrides.
And you make an important point there, which I know from my experience in another life in terms of driving change in large organizations. If you do too much or try and attempt to do too much too soon, like overnight change, it invariably fails because people just resist it. Change does take time, you know, and sometimes I understand myself that people can be frustrated by that. They know, but I want to do this right now. But if you want to aim to bring people with you in communities, you have to listen and engage and take the time with them. And it's time consuming, but it's incredibly valuable and needs to be done. So I think that was the right approach. And I hear too, I'm hopeful too, that there'll be further policy initiatives around land reform in the next Parliament. So I think you've clearly laid some good grounds with a piece of work you did.
And as you say, it's important we get it right. We can't afford to have any judicial challenges on any of the legislation that we put through. And you know, that's what takes the time. Getting it right is imperative.
Absolutely. So the deposit return scheme.
Yeah, yeah, well, deposit return, I mean, I've been a fan of it since I first saw it operating in Norway in the mid-80s, and I've been banging on about it ever since. When I first got elected to Falkirk District Council in '92, I discussed with officials the possibility of introducing a pilot in Falkirk District, but it was clear it wouldn't, you know, it would have to be a nationwide effort for it to work properly. So, I kept throwing it into the mix to anyone who would listen. And I think it's fair to say I was pretty instrumental in getting DRS into the 2016 programme for government. And it snowballed from there. My environment committee at Holyrood quickly set up a subgroup to look at the feasibility of it, although I have to admit my mind was already made up. And it progressed from that to a bill. So now plans have been drawn up behind the scenes with Zero Waste Scotland to launch next year. And that's a success that I'm not too shy in taking some credit for.
Yeah, well, good. And you mentioned obviously the environment committee. I mean, I remember posting one of your pages noting how much work and effort goes into the committees, which is an element of any legislature that is probably not understood, how much effort goes in there. And I mean, I remember I was on the BIS Select Committee in Westminster, and quite often you would get, you know, 60 pages of papers to read at very short notice before a meeting the next morning at 9. And of course, you're often challenging witnesses or asking for their information. And therefore, you have to be accurate because it's being televised as well. And is that your experience in Scottish Parliament as well, the amount of effort associated with it?
Absolutely, there's a lot of prep required for the committee work. I'm currently on two major committees: the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee and the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. And these have massive remits. And obviously, with the climate emergency that we have just now, there's extra work in the Eclair Committee that, you know, at the moment we're looking at the climate change plan update and scrutinising that and taking evidence from academics and stakeholders. So there's massive work involved in the committees that, as you say, isn't always seen. But it's important work that we do, and you know, we produce fairly significant reports regularly, and the government more often than not take everything that we recommend on board.
Yeah. Okay, so anyway, I suppose $1 million question then. Looking back, is there anything you would do differently, and if so, why?
Well, yes, I don't think there's anyone on the planet who could look back and say they wouldn't do anything differently. I've got two major regrets over my time in Parliament. The first one will possibly come as a surprise to many on here today. I regret voting against the eco-marriage bill in 2013. So there, I've said it. I had my reasons at the time, which if we have time, I'll briefly explain. In a weird way, it's kind of similar to the fracking situation. At the time of the vote, there remained concerns that churches would be legally challenged if they refused to allow same-sex weddings in their churches. And at the time, everyone was being swept along with the bandwagon, and I felt no one was speaking up for the churches who were also entitled to a voice in the debate. So I voted against, but knowing full well the bill would be passed given the groundswell of support, and in the end only 18 MSPs voted against it. So I obviously took some flack for that, not least from some individuals in Bowness, but as most of you will know, it had no impact whatsoever on my constituency vote, and I doubled my majority at the next election. But I have to say, I'm glad to be proved wrong. There have been no legal challenges, as far as I'm aware, and seeing the many happy couples on TV since the law went through, I'm actually quite happy to have been proven wrong. So certainly on that occasion. So,
well, and I think that's a very brave and honourable stance you're taking now, to openly concede in that way that you had a view at the time. And of course, I think that is the truth of it, that we are all growing and learning all of the time, and you make a decision at the time on the best available information you have and your own kind of personal thoughts. But we all change, and I think it would be foolish for any of us to say, you know, not to recognise that our views can change. And I think it's very honest of you to do that in that forum today. So, you mentioned something else as well.
Yeah, I'm glad I had the opportunity to say that and you know, clarify my position. My second regret is not putting forward a member's bill in Parliament for the introduction of a register of interests in Scotland's judiciary, which is a bit of a mouthful. This stems from a petition that came into my petitions committee in 2012 from Peter Cherby, calling for exactly that. And needless to say, obstacles were put in the committee's way at every turn, but at the back of it lay the argument that everyone else in public life has to register and declare their interests. So why not judges and sheriffs? So to cut a long story short, the petition was discussed at 25 sessions of the Petitions Committee and was then handed to the Justice Committee for them to deal with. and still we're sitting here with no register of interest for the judiciary. So my regret is that I didn't grab the bull by the horns and introduce a members' bill on it. But I'm glad to say that I've asked for it to be considered for inclusion in the forthcoming SNP manifesto. So we'll see if it's in it. But if not, it's always an issue that a member can take up with a members' bill of their own at some point in the future.
Yeah, I have to say that is something I agree with. Of course, Peter Cherby is a well-known legal journalist, and yeah. I mean there are a number of issues with the kind of regulation and so on around our legal systems. So, for example, how lawyers are investigated hasn't really, where somebody, a consumer makes a complaint, it's not really kept pace with the charitable sector, for example, or doctors, and they are known to be resistant to any kind of change. The CMA had called on that recently. Esther Roberton, who wrote a report about change and how lawyers are regulated and so on. And I absolutely agree with you about judges and sheriffs. I think it's a fundamental. So absolutely, if that does come back again, then I will be very, very supportive of it, because it is wrong. And Scotland's a small country, and that's a huge advantage in many areas, but you also need to therefore put in place the things that shows these linkages that can skew thinking. So I completely agree with you, and that is something that I would definitely want to support. Anyway, so
that's good to hear, Michelle. There's actually a very simple system in Norway that we could replicate without any difficulty. So hopefully that can be progressed.
Yes, indeed. And so what are your plans for the future then?
Well, as many of you all know, and as I said at the start, I'm returning to my roots in the Outer Hebrides. The family companies that we had up there have been wound down. We were wholesale and retail butchers, auctioneers and farmers. And while the farmers are still operating and trading against the odds, because you're battling against the weather and haulage costs up there all the time, the other businesses have closed. So I'll be looking to establish, along with my wife Linda, a self-catering business, and who knows, I might end up back in politics locally, just with a slight change of scenery.
And weather.
And weather, absolutely, yeah. A storm brewing up there just now. And I've another job lined up, which only entails 1 or 2 days per week, but I can't say too much about that at the moment. But whatever I do, guaranteed, I'll never forget the absolute honour and privilege it's been to serve the people of Falkirk East in Parliament for the past 10 years, and the good people of Grangemouth on the council before that. Every day that I walked into that Holyrood chamber and the council chamber, it was never a chore. It was always an honour and a privilege. And in addition, I never forget the people of the Oldenshire ward who put me on that path way back in 1992.
Yeah, I know what you're saying about it being an honour and a privilege. I remember when I held my first surgery as an MP, a lady came to see me. She was quite elderly with her daughter, and it's probably hard to replicate on screen, but she was so scared about coming to see me. She had her handbag, her arms wrapped around her handbag so tightly, and her daughter was there. And I mean, you don't really get any training for the sort of communication skills that are needed. And she sort of sat down, and our daughter kind of prompted her and said, you know, tell the MP what the issue is. And I just smiled and welcomed her. And she said, well, it started in 1947. And of course, in my head, I thought, this is going to be quite a long story. But without thinking about it, it was to do with a pension issue she'd had. I kind of just put my hand on her arm and said, you've come to the right place. Now, let me just hear what you've got to say. And I just did it instinctively. And I remember looking at her and thinking, I'll never, ever forget this moment, that she was so anxious coming in to see me, terrified. She was being coaxed by her daughter, and the humility associated with it, that you could help this person, because I mean, I spent quite a few misspent years in Standard Life as it then was, and I know about pensions, so I was able to help her. But you know, it was a privilege that small moment I was holding some of her hopes and fears, and I made a promise to myself that I'd never ever forget that. So I know exactly what you're saying about that. Well, again, I would say thank you very much for your contribution. I know it's massively appreciated. And, you know, I mean, I was only in Westminster for 2 years, I think 10 years, and all your remarkable community work as well. It's fantastic. So thank you for that.
That's really kind of you to say, Michelle. It's really appreciated, and I'll always have a special place in my heart for Falkirk District.
Yeah.
But I think it's perhaps time to move on and ask you some questions, Michelle. I know you're well known for your contribution to the first independence referendum and as a former MP, but it would be useful for listeners to know a bit more about your background.
Yeah, well, I was brought up in a wee place just outside Glasgow, and I originally went to study music at what's now the Royal Conservatoire for Scotland. It was called the RSAMD there, the Music and Drama College. And I went and did that because I love music, and I've always loved music, all types of music. And then I was a professional musician for a number of years. I did a bit of peripatetic teaching in schools, and I accompanied instrumentalists and singers on the piano. And then I became a musical director and a kind of composer in residence in a wee theatre in Fife. And at that point, computers were just coming into use and technology for music. And I started using various sort of recording devices to compose the music and sampling sounds and so on. And I thought, gosh, music is, IT rather, is so pervasive. Here am I, basically a classically trained musician, a kind of jobbing pianist, if you like, using this tech. And so I went off to Dundee and did a postgraduate diploma in information technology. And so that was like a launch into kind of programming and the sort of psychology of how you design systems, which we see now with like Apple Macs and so on. And then I actually became for a while a pretty not very good career as a computer programmer. I don't think I was a very good one. I found it quite difficult, just me and the machine and doing the logic, but it was a very good skill to learn. And I quite quickly became a systems analyst, and then a project manager, and then a program manager, and so on. And what that was about delivering large scale change in organizations. And what I used to say, and this has relevance for any kind of political role, you don't deliver change to people, you deliver change through people. So that idea that we were talking about earlier, by the time the vote on same-sex marriage came through, the vast majority of people, as you yourself commented, were like, yeah, I mean, why didn't we do this ages ago? Because people had been talking about it and they got used to the idea, and it does take time. So that was very, very useful skills I learned. I was at Standard Life for many, many years, and then RBS for a while when Sir Fred was at the helm, and that was culturally as an organisation very interesting, a very difficult environment. I mean, I wasn't like the banking side, I was like kind of managing programs. Then I left that and set up and ran a number of my own small businesses. So I've kind of like been involved in large businesses and run my own small businesses. So that's probably, and then obviously, as you said, I became an MP, and I've been running another small business called Momentous Change with a former MP, Roger Mullen, over the past 3 years.
Well, that's quite a mix. It'll certainly bring a great deal of experience to the job at both Holyrood and in Falkirk East, which we hope you're successful. But maybe you could expand on how you got interested in politics in the first place.
Yeah, well, I mean, well, politics is everything. You know, people, I think, who say, oh, I'm not interested in politics, when you say to them, but are you interested in how the tax you're required to pay is spent and what it's spent on? Are you interested in the fact that we try and have a safe society that has a rule of law? And of course, they always say, well, yes, of course I'm interested in that. Yes, therefore you're interested in politics. But for me, it was the first independence referendum that made me drop everything and get involved full time. I mean, I'd been an SNP member for many, many years, but with different levels of activity. I think that's quite common depending on the age of my children and so on. I did less when they were young and I was working full time and all the rest of it. But when I was quite young, I think I was about 17, I went and toured around the Highlands and Islands supporting Winnie Ewing in her bid to get re-elected with other young students, one of whom was John Swinney. So I've known him a long time. But it was really during the independence referendum, I felt so strongly, given what I have believed, that it's a normal state of affairs for a country to take responsibility for creating its own future. I thought, I cannot not be fully involved in this. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to look myself in the eye. So I remember putting down my pen and saying, I'm just going to be absolutely totally involved in it, and really stopped everything I was doing. And I've been asked to join the board of Business for Scotland. And from there, things kind of snowballed because there were very few women at that time who had some experience or could get the experience in the media talking about business and finance and economics. And as you recall, there was a lot of chat at the time about the risks of independence. And at this point, I would say, well, of course there's risks with independence, but there is also opportunities. And if you're going to have a proper grown-up discussion, you can't just talk about the risks, you have to talk about the opportunities. And I started using a lot of analogies about, you know, if Scotland is our business, how would we choose to run our business? What sort of choices would we be making? I suppose that kind of links with Scotland's future, Scotland's choices. But that was how, and having said, I want to, and I'm on record as saying that from about 2013 onwards, I wanted to use all my skills and knowledge and wide variety of experience to try and shape a better Scotland. Having made that promise, well, that was a promise I made to me, so I can't go back, you know, and I still feel exactly the same way. So.
Okay, that's excellent. I mean, you mentioned the NDRF1 campaign, and I certainly remember you being quite prominent on our TV screens at that time.
Yeah.
And you then became the MP for Edinburgh West. So how do you think Westminster will compare to Holyrood when hopefully you get there?
Well, you know, if I'm lucky enough to, in a lot of ways, I mean, for a start, the SNP is in opposition to the Tories in Westminster. So it is an opposition. So, for example, if you look today, Keir Starmer overlooking the opportunity to call the Tories out for their rule breaking in terms of procurement. I mean, I think he's perhaps forgotten the job of opposition, and that is to oppose. So that's what the SNP has been all about in Westminster. So the job at Westminster is all about highlighting where the Tory government are failing, and failing Scotland in particular. However, with the SNP in government currently, and we hope again in Scotland, it's about delivery for Scotland. I feel very strongly that Holyrood is our parliament. It's our parliament of our people. They should be able to see it as a legitimate chamber where they can hear their voices heard. And so that's why, for example, I'm very much in favour of diversity in the chamber. You know, perhaps arguably we don't have enough old age pensioners in the parliament because they're a large segment of our community. So it's a completely different job. It's one focused on delivery, on positive change for people in Scotland as compared to opposition in Westminster. So I imagine it'll be very different. And of course, there are differences in the way the legislation's run as well. And one thing I'm definitely looking forward to not having is a horrible braying that you see in Westminster. It's just, it's really quite unpleasant. It's really quite unpleasant, and it's got worse, I would say.
Yeah, it seems to be, and I certainly didn't envy any MP having to go down there and you know have to
Yeah.
experience that you know, that kind of culture. It's certainly a lot more civilized in Holyrood. There's no doubt about that. And of course, we don't have a second chamber. We use our committee system to oversee legislation. So that'll be quite a change for you as well.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, we'll see, you know, if I'm successful, I'm sure I will see lots of differences. But the comment you make about the culture, I think that's an important point. I mean, the behaviour, in particular of some of the Tory MPs in Westminster, is really quite blatant and most unpleasant. So I hope it's better in Holyrood if I get there.
Yeah, well, ever so slightly, yeah. If we could maybe come back to the constituency and look at some of the issues that are ongoing here. What do you see as the challenges for Falkirk East?
Yeah, well, I mean, I commented fairly extensively during the election campaign that the name Falkirk East as a constituency isn't particularly representative because it's not Falkirk and only part of it's east of Falkirk. And I've made very clear that understanding all the different identities of all the different areas of the constituency is incredibly important. Slemanan, Ayr, Skinflats, Brighton, Madison, Bowness, Blackness, Avonbridge, so on. These are all different places and they all have a different identity, a fiercely held identity. So giving voice to all of those people and also giving voice to Falkirk East where there's a perception, rightly or wrongly, I'm making no comment on that, that some areas feel somewhat remote and distant from Falkirk city centre and indeed the council. So I would want to be able to give voice to that. And I suppose it's one thing that I've always tried to do is to challenge things and pull things out. So for example, when I was on the Biz Select Committee in Westminster, I spoke, or in fact I was asked to lead in the inquiry into Sir Philip Green in his disgraceful treatment of BHS staff when he just allowed it to go to the wall. And also I did a lot of work tackling how the banks treated small businesses and the terrible way they behaved to them. So I think I am on record of being quite a kind of fighter. I think we'd say here a bonny fechter for getting stuck into things. And that's something I would like to be able to continue for Falkirk East to make sure its voice is heard.
Okay, we certainly look forward to seeing that in the future. On a wider scale though, how about the challenges you see for Scotland if you're elected in May?
Oh, well, I mean, you know, I think this is something that's going to run over all these things. It's a big debate because it's almost like, where do we start? Now, we know the strapline for the SNP is Scotland's future, Scotland's choice, because this is always about choices and having the power to make the choices we want to see. So we've seen just recently that we've been dragged out of Europe against our wishes. We've got the internal market bill providing a route for MPs to restrict our choices potentially in really significant ways, for example, in NHS procurement. And we, you know, so the actions arising potentially from Brexit and powers not coming back to the Scottish Parliament, but instead going to Westminster are areas of huge concern. But we can't forget about the pandemic. I mean, the fallout from the pandemic, for example, in mental health and other outcomes from that is going to be huge. The economic impacts rolling forward on ordinary lives are going to be huge as well. I mean, and there is a statement, economists will say that ultimately the pandemic, or rather the economic fallout, will kill more people than the pandemic it did itself because of the impact as it flows through into our society. And part of the challenge we have is that the Tories could choose to start another bout of austerity and cut public funding. Now, these are political choices. They will, of course, try and dress it up as economic choices, but they are political choices. And we've seen the impact of that over many years, particularly on the most vulnerable in our community. So there are huge challenges, but lastly, not least, and one about which I feel very strongly about climate change. It is the challenge of our age. Are we moving fast enough? No, we're not moving fast enough. So much more needs to be done. And sustainability as well. And I mean sustainability through everything that we do. And most people are just starting to get, you know, kind of come to the table on what that actually means and how they live their lives. And all of this feeds into my sense of urgency that Scotland's voice must be heard in the form of another independence referendum. These should be our choices, and this is our future. And there has clearly been a material change of circumstances, and democracy cannot be ignored, as the Tories are trying to do. And it looks highly likely that the Labour Party in Scotland, yet again, will side with the Tories to deny the democratic expression of the people of Scotland. So a lot to be done.
Certainly, Michelle, it seems that you're going to have a lot of plates to spin over the coming years if you're successful. And I have to say, I know what it's like spinning about 27 plates at the same time. But I think that's brought us nicely to the point where we should tackle some of the questions which I see are flooding in from our listeners.
Yeah, no, I'm just scrolling through. Yeah, we've got a lot of questions. Now, there's one here from Val Donaldson asking about my links with Falkirk. One of the small businesses I ran managed some properties in Falkirk. So we had some in Slamanan and in Falkirk Langleys, I think it was. So I can't claim that I was born and brought up in the constituency. That would be fundamentally dishonest, but neither is it true to say that I don't know it at all. Bits of it I know very well because of that. I remember dealing, ironically enough, with flooding issues in Slamanan years ago. I remember one occurred on New Year's Day. So thank you for that. Now, I've got one here from David Mitchell. How will you work with all layers of government, council, national, UK, to get the best results for our area? Okay, well, relationships are extremely important, and Angus will know as well what you see a lot on the kind of TV screens of people, political parties and the argy-bargy of FMQs or Prime Minister's questions. A lot of that is for the telly. Actually, you need to be able to work collaboratively with people, even where you regard them as political opponents and you disagree with them. So actually, there's a necessary part of working with people regardless of their politics to try and get consensus, to try and find some middle ground to move things forward. So you need to be able to develop good relationships there and build common ground and common cause, even where it feels difficult. And of course, with each level, the local councillors, for example, like some of the local councillors in Falkirk East, well, I'm already having meetings with them. I've already been attending community councils such as Bowness and Grangemouth. I've already gone along there. I'm already having meetings behind the scenes with key stakeholders. For example, I had one this week with the chief executive of Forth Valley College. So reaching out to people and building good relationships is absolutely fundamental. And I think that's where a lot of my experience in my previous life helps as well, that I've worked and lived in lots of different situations, not just in politics, and I think that brings something extra. Right, now, sorry if I do miss anybody, I apologise that there are a lot of questions on the screen. And there's one from Paul Haldane here about Alex Cole Hamilton and asking advice about how Sarah Mawson should tackle her campaign in Edinburgh Western. Well, I mean, to be honest, I don't think it's for me to tell Sarah how she should run her campaign. And I mean, you correctly point out that Alex Cole-Hamilton, in my opinion, behaved really very badly towards me. But maybe that's the nature of politics. I think he should have apologised and he hasn't, but sometimes that happens. But it's not up to me to tell Sarah how she should win her campaign. And I suppose in terms of what you're saying to people, I'm not a believer in negative politics. I mean, you see some politicians that all they do is kind of go after the person and make rude comments. I don't believe that that's appropriate. Yes, political parties take issue with their game or their policies and so on, but going after people in person, that's not something that I prefer to do. Right, okay. So there's a few questions here around postal votes, and I'll just say here, there's a perception, and I think it is a perception, that postal voting isn't safe. Postal voting is safe. Arguably, it is at less risk of fraud than voting in the normal manner. When you apply for a postal vote, you have to provide evidence that you are who you say you are, that you live where you say you live, and your signature and so on, and they do actually match the signatures. In my opinion, it is a very safe way, and critically at this time, it assures people that they will get a vote when, let's face it, we're living in very uncertain times with COVID. And I've put out a short video, and that video should apply to everybody, regardless of how they ultimately intend to vote. But please do register for a postal vote. Why would you take the chance that you don't get to make your voice heard? So I would encourage everybody, and I would absolutely strongly say it's an entirely safe way to vote. So the theories that were doing the rounds about, it was a way of fixing things, I don't believe that. They're administered by our local councils, they're heavily checked, they're very thorough and robust, and please do register. Okay, right. Okay. Right, how can, oh, here we go. Karsten Brinkman Steenwinkel, I hope I've pronounced your name properly. How can SNP members from mainland Europe help a better future for Scotland? It's so important. I mean, I think that the statements that Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, has made about how welcome people from any other country are in Scotland. I mean, I stand squarely behind that. We welcome the diversity of the thoughts and ideas. We welcome the fact that people want to come here and make their life here. And of course, they're contributing in ways they're working, they're paying tax, and we knew that EU nationals are net contributors to our economy, despite some of the stories that were put out by the Tories. But culturally as well, it brings fresh ideas, it brings a different perspective. And also, one area I would point out is that people coming from other shores can help Scots see themselves differently. I, along with my business partner, Roger Mullen, undertook a piece of research into the global Scottish business diaspora. And it really was evident how Scottish people, when they go and live in different countries, people there were saying to them, what is it with you guys kind of not running your own fairs? That's really, really odd. And that came through really clearly. So I absolutely welcome that. I think all your thoughts and ideas about how things are done differently, economically, culturally, and so on are welcome. So keep bringing your ideas and definitely keep contributing. And I personally have got no truck with the philosophy of the Tories that doesn't welcome them. Sorry. All right, now, I feel as though I should just let you come in and answer a question as well, Angus, as a sitting MP, and I'm going to have a drink of water for a minute.
Okay, maybe I could come in with a wee anecdote on the back of Karsten Steenwinkel's question. I remember Karsten used to live here. He's back in either Germany or Denmark. But a wee anecdote that might be of interest to the listeners. I attended a reception at the Icelandic Consul General's residence a couple of summers ago down in Leith, and the Icelandic ambassador was there. From London, and he gave a speech, and I'm sure he doesn't mind me sharing this because it was fairly public. And he said that Iceland wanted to be the first country in the world to officially recognise an independent Scotland, which went straight to all our hearts as we were standing listening. And of course, Iceland has a record in doing that because they were the first to recognise the Baltic states when they became independent. So we've got a lot of good friends out there in Europe, and many of them are willing us on and wondering why it's taking so long. So particularly in the Nordic region, all the Scandinavian countries and the other Nordic countries are extremely supportive behind the scenes. So we can count on their support in the future, which is heartening.
Yeah, and I found that as well when I went on a number of trips with the Biz Select Committee. Countries abroad, they clearly understood the different philosophy in Scotland, particularly about openness, social inclusion, justice, and so on. And they recognise that. In fact, I mean, I think, to be honest, I was regarded as a bit annoying by the chair of the committee because I always brought up the fact that Scotland thought differently on the international stage. And I suppose that, to me, is one of the advantages of being a sovereign state. For Scotland being independent, we can perform differently on the world stage to how the UK likes to perform. Not for me, the strutting and post-imperialism that we see particularly is getting worse, if anything. So right, yeah, so Peter Steele, how will you reach the maximum number of people in Scotland as possible in making the choices and decisions required as powers return from Westminster during transition out of the UK? It's a very good question. In general terms, how I think that much more can always be done to engage with people. At a local level, again, I'm on record saying that even within the SNP, engagement with members is incredibly important. It's hard work and it's time consuming, but it's incredibly important within your local community as well, and with people across Scotland. So I remember when the Scottish Parliament used to travel, or, you know, of course, the building didn't move, the parliamentarians would travel to different locations. I thought that was a good idea. I think more of that should be done. The recent citizens' assemblies, which of course have just reported back, I think they should be established as something that happens all of the time, because people need to have engagement. It's absolutely the job of a parliamentarian to give voice to people. And I think sometimes some parliamentarians forget that they're giving voice to people and think it becomes only their voice. And of course, it can never be like that. So I think that is a lot of work that needs to be done. And building engagement. And what I said at the beginning about delivering change through people and not to people is so important. People need to understand, they need to be involved and make their voices heard. Right. And thank you for the comment about the light in my face. I missed who made that, but I did notice that myself. So if you've seen me sort of sitting back, it's because I could see my face on the screen go. It's just the way the sun was shining into my study here. Should Hancock resign? Yes, this is absolutely outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. I said earlier that I was dismayed that Sir Keir Starmer couldn't even be bothered to call for his resignation. He didn't think that was necessary. what on earth is going on? And I mean, it's quite a clear legal breach. Of course, he should resign. It's simply not good enough. Question, will Wales be independent after Scotland? I mean, I think, obviously, again, it's up to the people of Wales, but I suspect that a lot of people will start to feel differently in Wales because of the behaviour of the Tories over Brexit, even though Wales, as we know, voted in favour of it. But there seems to be quite a madness in Westminster about how the Tories are behaving towards other countries that are not England. And I think that will start to change perceptions as it has done here. And I'm sure we've all met a lot of people who are feeling differently about self-determination for Scotland as a direct consequence of how the Tories in Westminster have behaved. But of course, I don't know. And it's ultimately up to the good people of Wales. Yes, Thomas, why wear a scarf in the house? Are you cold? Yes, I am cold. We were having a laugh before the programme started that because it was quite sunny this afternoon, my husband goes around turning all the radiators off. And when I sat down and we were about to start, I thought, I can't go on and put on another jumper. And I had a scarf just at my desk here. So yes, I am cold actually. Okay. Right, okay. Now we've got a bit in here, a couple of questions about the constituency vote and the list vote. And I know there's a lot of debate about this, what should people do? Now, it seems, it's absolutely clear to me, I'm standing here on the platform as your SNP candidate. And so yes, both votes should be SNP. When the SNP won a landslide in 2011, it was that as a direct consequence, because of that mandate that led to independence referendum number 1, IndyRef 1. We need to get the same again. Now, I know some other parties have appeared at the table, but we're not yet certain, well, who are they? What will their policies be? How are they funded? I'm not entirely sure about that. And trying to game the list system is incredibly complex. My advice has to be both votes SNP. If you want to be assured of legitimacy, that legitimate mandate of Scotland's voice saying we need to hear our voices heard in the form of another independence referendum. Jackie Morris, can you help the WASPI women? Yes, definitely. It's an absolute outrage what has happened. And as you know, the SNP have progressed this. And I took part in a lot of the events when I was in Westminster to support WASPI women. There was quite a number of demonstrations and I met quite a few of the constituents I had then in Edinburgh West. Yes, it still needs to be resolved. Right, okay. Right, I know I'm going to go back up to the top. Angus, do you want to jump in there? Because I know I've missed some. Bear with me because there's just quite a lot in there.
Yeah, there's one asking about an update on a train station in Grangemouth.
Grangemouth, yes.
Now, I mean, obviously, I've been working on this since day one, and even before that, you know, when I was on the council. There are still plans in train, if you excuse the pun. The new investment zone that's targeted at Grangemouth has the passenger train station included in the plans for that. So Falkirk Council are working on that behind the scenes as we speak. And there'll be a consultation with the public in the hopefully not too distant future. So it's very much still on the cards, and I look forward to seeing it come into fruition. There have been so many false dawns. I mean, I remember back in 1995, we nearly had it. In fact, the money was allocated by the old Central Regional Council, and then Camelin pinched it from us, which was quite frustrating at the time. So we could have had it way back in 95, but it wasn't to be. But definitely still on the cards, and hopefully we'll see it pretty soon. There needs to be a significant upgrade on the signalling, but the money for the platform, I think, is ring fenced. So
yeah. And obviously, that is something that I'll be looking to progress as well. I mean, there's a great deal of work needs to be done in Grangemouth, of which the train station is one example. And I'm almost surprised that we haven't had any questions today about either the port or INEOS, given some of the issues that are there. And I've had quite a lot of meetings with people there about what needs to be done. So I will definitely be pushing hard for a train station. I'm well aware that that is regarded as very important in the community. Raymond Young, the Tories are still in front of Labour. Why? Yeah, I mean, it's a mystery, but I mean, obviously this is what's happening in England, and we see that with the polling position. I mean, to be honest, I don't think Sir Keir Starmer has really made the impact that people hoped he would. I think he struggled to get his messaging right, and he hasn't got the hang of the fact that he's meant to oppose what the Tories do. You know, also in terms of Brexit, he's just kind of rolled over. And I think the Labour Party in Westminster have got a problem because they voted for the deal. The Tories are going to say, well, you voted for it. So I think that was very unwise with them. But why are they in front? It's very hard for me to answer that question. Is it about a perception of more competence? I honestly don't know, because I just can't ever imagine voting Tory. I just can't imagine why you would do that, given that their policies and the impact it has on people. So I don't know the answer to that. Right, Robert Spears, will you stop funding cuts to local councils? I mean, you might be surprised that I'm answering that. Look, let's not forget that public sector finance and cuts that have been imposed on the Scottish Government and then on to local councillors. And I know the challenges that the local councils, in fact, local councils everywhere, have had trying to make cuts. It's a very, very difficult and challenging time for councillors who are at the sharp end of communities. To my mind, that is one of the reasons why I'm in favour of owning and distributing the money that is raised in Scotland. There's a lot of areas where the cuts for coming from Westminster that flow into the Scottish Government. So I mean, I can't promise that that local councils won't continue to struggle, and ultimately the big policy decision by the Tories, whether they choose to go after more austerity, spoiler alert, I think it's highly likely they will, that will impact us all. It will impact the Scottish Government, and that will impact on local councillors. And that is why we need to have control over our economic resources. Right, okay, 2 minutes. We've got 2 minutes before we finish. Jim Swan, although I'm a staunch yes supporter, I know a lot of the undecided people are worried about the council. Can you clear up the situation? Right, there'll be a currency. There'll be a currency. I mean, this whole debate has totally been hijacked. That's not the be all and end all. There is no other country in the world, and believe me, I've researched this, that's gone away and gone, oh, which currency? Some of them run dual currencies, some of them launch their own currencies fairly quickly. Ireland, as you know, shadowed the UK for years and years. It depends on the prevailing economic circumstances. The plan is for an independent Scotland to use the pound in the immediate term. It's our pound, we can use it if we like, and nobody can stop us. And ultimately, the decision is based on how you transition important considerations like pensions and mortgages. They're a much bigger discussion, and getting the information out there, how we deal with that. There'll be a currency. And we've allowed ourselves to be hijacked in this debate as though it's a concern. It's not a concern. We need to get real data and information out there about that. Right. Anyway, you can tell it. You can tell it. I feel quite strongly about that. Right. Okay. I'm laughing at that one about the scarf. Oh, hang on. We've got a. Yeah, Oh, I think it's about, I was just about to tackle that last one, but I think I would probably get cut off because the live stream finishes in 30 seconds. About drugs, horror and despair drugs bring to users and their families. Absolutely, I'm so pleased that Angela Constance is in position and is giving this the importance it has to have. Absolutely dreadful situation, and I want to cover that off in more detail in subsequent streams. Universal basic income, UBI, yes, absolutely. Stephen Aikenhead, yes, I think the UK missed a trick in not implementing that. People need to have dignity. They need to have food on their table, and it's one way of doing that. And nobody talks about the economic benefits of what that can bring to communities. People who have less money spend that money in their communities. Everybody wins. Yes. So I'm strongly in favour of UBI. Right. Okay. I think we are going to get cut off now, where we're booked till 4:30. I will be advertising the dates of the next one, and I will be holding them frequently all the way up to the election. And I think this is part of my thing about, despite a pandemic, there can be no reason for people not to engage. And I know I haven't covered off all of the questions today, but these are good questions, and they're going to come up because we're going to do quite a few of these, and I will be getting some guests as well. So please do register for a postal vote. You can look at my website, you can look at my Facebook page, you can look at my Twitter account, my YouTube channel, and Instagram as well. And I'll be putting out lots of content, and I'm easy to catch up with as well in terms of my email address. So I'd just like to finish off and say thank you very much, Angus, for joining me today. And thank you again publicly for all the hard work you've done for Falkirk East. If I can get anywhere near, if I'm elected, matching that, then I'll be very proud. Right. Okay, thank you then. Bye.